So now we're looking at theater in colonial North America, late 17th to early 18th century. One of the first things you really need to realize about this era is that North America is not Canada and America. It's split into New France, which is Canada, and New England, which is the American colonies. So you've got two different political realms you're dealing with here that don't necessarily always get along and are sort of now right next to each other, but they also have all of their rules and restrictions of their homelands. So the best way to kind of go about this is to break it down by important dates and put things where they are. And so looking at your list here, in 1605 it says the first new play to be written in North America, that means both of those what later become countries, is produced in Nova Scotia, Canada. And that is the Theatre of Neptune in New France, which would have been Le Théâtre de Neptune and Nouvelle France would be how it would have been written at that point in time, but obviously we put it in English for you. So, not much is really known about that play. It's not extant. Extant means that it's still in existence. So, not a whole lot known about it, but it is documented at least that it was the first play that was written over in this continent. Then we have in 1665 on your list the earliest recorded performance in America is in Virginia, and it's Ye Bear and Ye Cub. The interesting thing about that is why it's recorded as a performance is because the three guys were hauled off to jail for performing it because performances were illegal at this point in time. So that's actually why we have the record of it. By the way, since we're in North America, I am now drinking a Shiner for our lecture here today. So, next on your list is Canada, prohibition of performances over controversy from one of Moliere's plays, but it was produced there, Tartuffe. The controversy itself isn't, I haven't found any records on that of what exactly it was about it, other than perhaps just a controversy over performance because it wasn't allowed. But France really wasn't going through that era of performances are banned like England was. So I can't say for sure what the controversy in and of itself was. But we know that there was a performance at that point in time because there was controversy over it, which then led to a prohibition of all performances. Next on your list is a guy by the name of Richard Hunter who obtains permission to give theatrical performances in here. Okay, and there's not a lot said about it. It's just that we know that this is in America, well, in the colonies, in the American colonies, or in New England. We know that he was given permission to give some performances. So now that sort of a prohibition of performances in the New England area, in what we call the United States, or colonial United States, that now has sort of been lifted, or at least in this instance, for this person in this general vicinity, he's allowed to give them. The next thing we have is Anthony Astor, the first professional actor to arrive in America. This is 1703, so it's really only 4 years past when Richard Hunter was initially given his permission. And within those 4 years, we know for a fact that there were at least several different places giving performances because Anthony Astor toured. He came over here, he knew a few people in various places like Virginia and New York, Pennsylvania. And so he toured these places before leaving and going back to England. And that was the first professional actor here. I'm not certain if he came over here specifically to do a tour, or if he came over here for whatever other reason, they just didn't like it. But the sort of sentiment is that he was really doing this kind of tour to get money, enough money to book passage back to England because they didn't like it here. So, the next thing we have under here is 1714. The first extant play in America, means it still exists, you can still find a copy of it. It's called Androboros, or Man-Eater. And it's published by Robert Hunter. To my knowledge, no relation to the earlier Richard Hunter we were talking about. Robert Hunter was the governor of New York at the time, and the interesting thing about this particular play is it wasn't so much a play as an entertainment to who we're used to when we talk about plays, but really it was just this horrendous political attack on all of his political opponents. So kind of like a play-length commercial you see during election time. Now we look at 1716. William Livingston of Williamsburg builds the first theater in the soon-to-be United States. All right, so this in Williamston, Virginia, is the first theater that was built as a theater. A lot of the theaters that we talk about in New England are going to be places they've outfitted. So that means it was in a warehouse or it was some kind of structure that had been used for something else, and they outfit in theater, like the French and the English used to do with tennis courts. We see that here a lot. But this is the first one that was specifically built to be a theater. And as a matter of fact, Charles and Mary Stagg began to arrange entertainments there. So it became a fully functioning theater with a company. In 1723 to 1724, there are strolling players that are performing in Philadelphia. One of the things you need to understand about this era also is that New York was not the center of theatrical activity at this time. It actually was more Philadelphia, and then you see Virginia sort of pick up, and North Carolina, oddly enough, become sort of the centers of theatrical activity. New York picks up somewhere in the mid-1700s, and then it blossoms into what we know as a theater mecca nowadays. But that doesn't really happen until the mid-18th century, and then, well, once we get into the 19th century, it really kicks in as a central hub for theater in America. 1730 to 1733, and this is kind of an interesting one here, is that amateur players in New York stage plays and outfitted theater. So the cool thing here is that what we're looking at is sort of amateur troupes, what we would probably consider community theater today, really. These people are doing a small number of plays, but still being sort of capable of garnering enough money to outfit their own theater. There's a lot of community theaters today that still don't have their own place. And these groups right here are just doing a season or 2 seasons maybe, and making enough money to outfit a theater. So one that we'll talk about in a little bit, after 1 season of 3 plays, builds a theater. So pretty kind of, I think the opportunities at that time were a lot more open to people as far as theater is concerned. So looking at the next section, 1730 to 1742, regular performances are given in Lancaster. Now this is Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And it is a series of strolling performances that are in places they've outfitted. It's really not to the point where Lancaster has constructed its theater, a theater building, and it's a really important landmark in theater history. That won't come until the Fulton Opera House later. And that theater actually is still in existence and still running as a theater. I think it was built somewhere around 1842. It's the oldest. It's actually America's oldest continuously running theater, the Fulton in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But that doesn't come for a while. 1735, Charleston, South Carolina. Amateurs give a season of 3 plays. 1 year. This is the one I was talking about. One group of amateurs give 1 season of 3 plays. By 1736, they're already building their own theater. Not outfitting a place, building a theater. That takes us down to the late 1730s with George Whitefield and John Wesley. Your board notes say, bring religious fervor to colonies, theatrical activity stops. Okay, let me give you a little background on who they are specifically. George Whitefield is the effectively founder in England, but also brought it over to America, of the Anglican Church, if you're familiar with that. John Wesley is the founder of the Wesleyan Church. Both Protestant, both don't necessarily see eye to eye. These guys were friends and they kind of worked together, but they also did not have the same theological ideas. So they opposed each other at a number of specific points in their theology. So they weren't this united massive front. They were a united massive front of religious fervor, but in different sort of sects. When I say fervor, I'm talking about these people would preach to, say, groups of tens of thousands. So that wasn't too difficult at that time then, for them to be able to have the power to wipe theater pretty much off the map. Keep in mind that those type of zealous religious people still were of the mindset that England was still in, it was in earlier, of theater should not be allowed. And so you're kind of almost talking Puritan, but I don't want to say Puritan because the Puritans are a vastly different sect than Wesleyans or the Anglicans. But it is sort of that God doesn't permit this, 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 and this, and that's what stopped theater for a while here. Now, in 1745, on your list here, you see John Moody arrives in Jamaica. So John Moody was an actor in England. He was a sort of a strolling actor in England, and he arrived in Jamaica. And the performances have been given there since like 1680, just sort of sporadically, amateurs. He arrived there and started working with some amateur troops and said, you know what, there's a lot of attendance here, there's a lot of room for theater to really grow down here in Jamaica, so I'm going to head back to England, get a professional troupe, send it back, all right, so we're making some money. So he returned to England in 1749 and put together a troupe there. That's going to be important in a little bit. So, well, I guess we'll actually get into it right now. 1749, Moody returns to England, brings professional actors back. 1751, Moody sends back a company headed by a guy named David Douglas, who's going to be very important very soon. And David Douglas goes back to Jamaica with this troupe. So he, in 1751, is in Jamaica. 1752, William Hallam sends his troupe. We talked about this a little bit in the last section there in England. Now we're going to get a little bit more in-depth into it. And you'll see on your board notes, got a whole section named listed on the Hallams. So we'll jump back to them after we finish this sort of chronological thing here. So this is the beginning, 1752, of professional theater in America. And we'll give you actually a series of chronological dates with the Hallams after we're done with this section here. 1774, I think on your board notes there might be a bit of a kind of a typo on it. I think it says the first English language play is written in Canada, and it's called Arcadia. That's what it actually meant was the first English language play in Canada is written. All plays prior to this were written in French. In 1774, we have the first actual play in Canada that was written in English, and that was Arcadia, or Arcadius, excuse me. By 1775, we have the Revolution, the American Revolution, which sort of stops all theatrical performances. And you'll find this throughout history a lot of times when we get into wars, that theatrical performances tend to cease, and then they revive back right toward the end of the war. The interesting thing is that it didn't really cease. The amateur players ceased, the professional performing troops ceased. Actually, they went down to Jamaica during that period. But what we have records of theatrical performances continuing actually by the soldiers in the camps on both sides. So we know that theater continued. It just kind of wasn't as structured and organized as what we had in the mainland, between the amateur players and professional players. So we don't really know exactly what they performed. We don't know how it was received. We don't really know a whole lot about the production values either. Just that soldiers tended to put together small plays and produce them, kind of to sort of ease the tension, whatever you want to do, sort of like we do with the USO today. The last thing you see on here in the 1780s is that theater begins to revive, and that's sort of toward the end of the Revolutionary War. Theater starts to pick back up. Now, something you don't have on the board notes, going back to 1749 for a minute, there were two guys, Walter Murray and Thomas Keene. They led a company, and that appeared in Philadelphia, and it played until about 1750. And then they moved on to New York, traveled in Virginia, and even in Maryland, until around 1752. Not much is heard of them after that. So it wasn't really a huge impact, but we do know that it was a troupe that was traveling around playing. You know, of course, by the time 1752 gets here, the Hallam troupe has come over and probably either absorbed those guys as part of their troupe or pretty much stomped them out. That's probably why we don't hear anything from them after 1752. So while it is a historical note, it's not necessarily a huge impact in theater history. So now let's look at the Hallams. In 1740s, William Hallam was running a theater, and it says on your notes there a Wells Theater, possibly Sadler's Wells. I don't think it wasn't Sadler's Wells. It was the New Wells Theater that he was running, which then, of course, after it was discovered and whatnot, had to be closed down because of the Licensing Act of 1737 that only let Covent Garden and Drury Lane as licensed theaters exist. He was also in charge of the Goodman Fields Theater at one point in time. Again, licensing acts killed that one as well. So in 1751, after the theater went bankrupt and had closed down due to the Licensing Act, he sends his troops to America with his brother Lewis Hallam. Now, Lewis Hallam ran the troupe, and it operated on the share plan, just like it had in England. And when they got to America in 1752, they outfitted a theater in Williamsburg, Virginia. Outfitted, which means they didn't build a theater, they took a space that was already in existence and turned it into a theater. That's the date, 1752, in Williamsburg, Virginia, when professional theater in America began. So again, they toured. Also, they played Philadelphia, they played New York, and they finally sailed to Jamaica in 1755. That's where they met David Douglas. David Douglas was doing his touring, his troupe down there. They ran into David Douglas. He got connected with their company. 1756, Lewis Hallam dies. His wife takes over the company. By 1758, she marries David Douglas. Now David Douglas is the head of the company, and they changed the name to the American Company. This is a very important company for American theater. So they continued to play on the mainland from 1750s, 1758 or so until 1762. And they played places like New York and Philadelphia, but they also, from 1761 to 1762, they played performances in Rhode Island, making that the first professional production performances in New England. In 1762, they returned to Jamaica for a while, and they come back for a few. They're there for a few years, and they come back in 1766, returning to the mainland. Now, in 1766, it's kind of important because when they come back to the mainland, they start building theaters, not outfitting, building. So they built a professional theater, first one in Southwark in Philadelphia, and the next one the next year, 1767, in the John Street Theater in New York. So that's two professional theaters built by the Hallams, which continued on even after they stopped touring. 1767, another important fact is that they produced the first American play to be given a professional production. So instead of doing plays from England, they took an American play written by Thomas Godfrey, the Prince of Parthia, and it's got a professional production. So this is sort of like, yes, we've seen American plays being produced earlier on, Ye Bear and Ye Cub, and the Moros. This is the first one to be given a professional theater production, the Prince of Parthia. In 1768, they went to Canada to tour for a bit, and they were in Halifax for a while. So that's they stayed there for a bit, and then in 1774, the Continental Congress passed a law pretty much ceasing all theatrical activity because the revolution was imminent. Well, they're a professional acting troupe, so they had to leave. So they went back to Jamaica in 1775 during the revolution. So that pretty much ends sort of the Hallams. Now, looking into the next section of their theaters, the share plan, actor manager, and star system, this is the exact same thing we talked about when we were talking about David Garrick. The share plan where the certain actors would have shares and the others would be paid a small fixed sum per show. The star actor that David Garrick sort of created and built, commanding a certain sum, so on and so forth, and having certain things that were expected to be given to them. And always, a lead role and so on and so forth. So that system is what the Hallams brought over and imported it here to America. And it's a system that stayed around for a little while. We'll see that change when capitalism comes to theater, and we'll talk about that in our next section when we deal with theater in America. We're done.